Well, good morning. How's everyone doing today? Good. Man, it is so good to be up here. If we haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Kylie. I go here. I don't really know. I can't say I'm on staff anymore, but I do attend, and this is my church, and I love you guys, and I am always honored when I get the opportunity to preach to you. So, good morning. It is so good to have you guys here. If I haven't had a chance to say hello, welcome to church. So I thought I would start off this morning with a story of when I was a little girl. So when I was about 5 or 6, my parents took my sisters and I, along with the grandparents on both sides of my family, like my dad's mom and my mom's mom, on a trip to Disney World. And this was something that they had been saving up for a very long time. As you can imagine, 5-year-old Kylie was like psyched out of her mind to be going to Disney World, like the happiest place on earth. It was an amazing trip that bonded us as a family. And my mom's dad had recently passed away, and so this was kind of an opportunity for us to grieve together as a family in the happiest place on earth, because who better to grieve with than Mickey Mouse, right? Especially when you're 5 years old. And so this trip kind of helped us grieve this great, incredible man who had recently passed away. But on our way to the airport, a tire blew out in our car. And this was we're talking 2001, okay? So no one had cell phones. I mean, super rich people did, but my family did not have cell phones. We had no way to contact anyone. We had a plane to catch. Again, this was 2001, this was 2000, so we weren't planning on post-2001 security, you know what I mean? So we weren't getting there 3 hours early. We had a plane to catch in the next hour, and we had no idea what to do. So we sat on the side of the road on the interstate, just watching car after car after car pass us by. And I'm sure my parents were freaking out on the inside. They stayed pretty calm, but if I were in their shoes, if I had 3 young girls that I had to keep off the interstate, had to try to protect them from getting kidnapped or hit by a car or whatever worst case scenario parents always think of, I don't know what I would be doing. And they also, at the same time, had to figure out how to change the tire in the car and, just all of these different things. I'm sure they were freaking out. And by the way, this story is the reason I always have a phone charger on me and why I keep a fire starter kit in the glove compartment of my car. This story taught me to be very paranoid about car rides. That's not a joke. I could start a fire at any time. But then, out of nowhere, as we're just watching car after car pass us by, we see one car turn on their hazards, pull over, get out, and say, "Hey, do you guys need help?" We had never seen this guy before in our lives. I don't know that I would recognize him if I saw him again. I remember the event, but I'm not really I don't think in pictures, and so I don't really remember what he looks like. I would not recognize him if he were to walk up to me right now. But I'm sure he was going somewhere, right? No one just drives around the interstate for fun. So I'm sure he was on his way somewhere. I'm sure he had plans. But he pulled over. He saw a young family with 3 little girls, parents who were freaking out, a tire completely blown. And his first thought was, I need to help this family. So again, at different time, completely different time than today, he actually gave my mom, my sisters, and I a ride to the airport. And we made our flight. And my dad stayed behind, and he was able to change the tire in the car. In hindsight, as I think about it, it's I don't know why, could we not have just waited for my dad to change the tire? But we didn't. We got in the stranger's car because that seemed like the right thing to do. And he took us to the airport, and we made our flight. And my mom was able to get all 3 of the kids through security, the very limited security they had in 2000. And we were able to make it onto the flight. And my dad was the last one on. It was one of those like, paging Nate Rubenstein, but he made it on our flight, and we got to experience this trip that I've already told you about, this trip of a lifetime where we were able to grieve my grandfather in just a beautiful way as a family. I wish I had the opportunity to thank that man. You know, he has no idea the impact he had on our family. He had no idea that we were taking a trip where we were going to grieve a man who died way too young. You know, he had no idea what was going on in our lives. All he saw was a young family on the side of the road. We could have been meth dealers for all he knew. Like, the kids could have been a cover-up, you know? Like, he didn't know. He just saw someone in need. He took the time out of his day, was late to wherever he was going to help us out. He is an anonymous hero in my life. And he has no idea. And he never will. But his one seemingly insignificant act made a huge difference in my life. So thinking about that story and this unnamed hero of my childhood, it makes me wonder how many times a day or a week someone makes some small, unnoticed gesture that has huge impacts in my life or the life of people I love. You know, there are several times throughout the Bible where one person, and oftentimes the stories we're going to look at today, it's often a slave or a servant, someone with seemingly no authority over their own life. But they make one small move that sets up an entire domino effect. And it ends up changing the outcome, not just of their life, but of eternity. So we're going to look at a couple of examples like that today. To start off with, some of us in this room might be familiar with the story of Joseph. He's in the book of Genesis. If you're not familiar, Joseph had 11 older brothers, so he probably often felt like an unnamed hero in his own life. I'm sure he often felt drowned out by the noise of his older siblings. And his older siblings hated him so much that they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And while in Egypt, he gets thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. All of this is in the book of Genesis. If you're not familiar, I would recommend you read it or you watch the movie, The Prince of Egypt. It's pretty much the same thing. And while in prison, his two cellmates have dreams that Joseph is able to interpret through the help of God. And so one of his cellmates is the cupbearer to the king. It's essentially an elevated servant's position. So he's cupbearer to the king. In other words, he's the one who offers the drink to the king after tasting it himself to make sure it hasn't been poisoned. So if someone's out to get the king, he's kind of the first line of defense against poison. So eventually the cupbearer is released from prison, and he's restored to his former position as cupbearer. And the last thing Joseph says to him is like, hey, it'd be really cool if you didn't forget about me. If you remembered that I'm innocent and I'm kind of just rotting here in this prison. Everyone's forgotten about me, but it'd be really cool if you didn't. So the first thing the cupbearer does when he gets out of prison is completely forget about Joseph. And years pass until one night, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, has a dream that he has no idea how to interpret. And so finally the cupbearer is like, oh yeah, wasn't there this guy who interpreted my dream once? And so he goes up to the king. And in Genesis 41, the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. So in Genesis 41:9, it says this, finally the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. So if you're familiar with this story, you know what happens next. You know that from this point on, this kind of standing before Pharaoh kind of becomes a turning point in Joseph's life. He goes from youngest brother to slave to prisoner to second in all of Egypt. Only the king, only Pharaoh himself has more power than Joseph. And it's because of this one moment where an unnamed, unimportant character decides to speak up. After Joseph is released from prison, we don't really hear a lot about the cupbearer anymore. But he became an unnamed hero in Joseph's life. Imagine a world where this unnamed cupbearer had remained quiet, where he hadn't said anything to the king, where Joseph hadn't had his opportunity to stand before the king and to tell him, hey, a famine is coming, and if we don't prepare, all of Egypt and all of Canaan, everyone is going to die. This one moment of this cupbearer speaking up gets Joseph positioned in a place where he can save hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. He could have said nothing, but he didn't. And then after that, if we fast forward a little bit, Joseph ends up saving Egypt and Canaan, and he saves food, and they have this amazing food saving structure. I don't really know how it worked back then, how they preserved food for 7 years, but they make it work, and it happens, and people's lives are saved. And then that generation dies, and a new king of Egypt comes into power. A new generation of Joseph's family, the Israelites, they grow up and they multiply. And they become stronger and stronger, and this new king of Egypt is scared. And nothing powers racism more than fear. And so this king he's so scared of how quickly the Israelites have multiplied in his land. And so here's what he says. Here's what this wise king says in Exodus 1. Then Pharaoh, the new king of Egypt, gave this order to Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Why have you done this, he demanded. Why have you allowed the boys to live? I love this. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. I think these two women deserve their own movie, right? I mean, first of all, they've obviously got some spunk, and I just think they would be great characters. But can you imagine being in their position? Can you imagine being ordered to do something so ruthless and having the courage to say no? I have no doubt that their lives were on the line, right? If the king was willing to order the slaughter of babies, imagine what he would do to someone who deliberately disobeyed him. And yet these two ladies that we know nothing else about put their lives on the line to save an entire generation of Israelite boys. Again, unnamed, well, I guess we do have their names, but really insignificant heroes who were in the right place at the right time and did the right thing. So that generation of babies grew up, and they continued to grow as a nation. And they are brought out of Egypt by God. And after some trials, they become established as a kingdom with a king of their own. And by some trials, I mean like generations of trauma. It's a lot of trials. I don't want to skip over, but after some trials, they become established, and they establish a king, and his name is Saul. And Saul is troubled in his own way, and he has a lot of challenges as king. He really lets the power get to him. It's really a tragic story. But one day, Saul's soul is troubled. And so he does what I think many of us would do. He wants to listen to music, right? Because nothing calms a troubled soul like our favorite song. And so in 1 Samuel 16, Saul asks if anyone knows of a musician, someone who can help him calm his nerves by playing music. So again, a servant. One of the servants said to Saul, "One of Jesse's sons from Bethlehem is a talented harp player. Not only that, he's a brave warrior, a man of war, and has good judgment. He's also a fine-looking young man, and the Lord is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse to say, "Send me your son David the shepherd." So Jesse responded by sending David to Saul along with a young goat, a donkey loaded with bread, and a wineskin full of wine. Because, what do you give a king who has everything? So David went to Saul and began serving him. Saul loved David very much, and David became his arm bearer. And again, from that point on, David goes from a young shepherd boy who had recently been anointed king. But if you're familiar with the story, you know that it's years, like a decade and a half, from the time that David is actually anointed king to the time he actually sits on the throne. And in between that time, there's many things that David has to go through. There's a lot of ways that he has to grow as a person. There's a lot of things God has to teach him. There's a lot of things he has to learn about himself. But that whole process of him growing and becoming the person who would arguably become the greatest and goodest king of Israel, that whole process starts in this moment when David meets Saul. Because Saul becomes the catalyst for most of the growth, most of the trials that David has to come through. Saul becomes the catalyst for David growing into the person who would be the greatest king of Israel. God uses Saul in really challenging, yet really miraculous ways to mold David into the person he's supposed to be. And it starts with this servant man, servant boy, I don't know what he is. Someone with no power, no authority. We don't even know his name. But he's in the right place at the right time, and he speaks up. He does the right thing. I don't know if you guys are seeing a pattern. But long after King David, long after David goes through those trials, he becomes king. He's an amazing king with amazing challenges and amazing mistakes. Long after that, the nation of Israel is captured and destroyed. And eventually there's a remnant who is allowed to return back to Jerusalem, to their home that has been completely destroyed. The wall has been torn down. The temple's been decimated. Their homes are just piles of ash. And this remnant of Israel is tasked with the insurmountable goal of rebuilding their homeland. And two men step up, and they become the leaders of this project. Their names are Ezra and Nehemiah. They both have a book named after them in the Bible. I'd recommend you read it. You read them. And so these two men, they step up and they kind of lead these projects to rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple. And yet, even though they're the leaders, even though they're the ones we talk about, even though they're the ones we preach about, most of the work is done by unnamed, powerless, former slaves who have just recently been released to come home. And then in the New Testament, we see the same thing happening, right? Jesus, one day, he's preaching, and he's preaching for hours, and somehow, miraculously, there's like 5,000 men there, plus women and children, and one person remembered to bring lunch. Like, I think that in and of itself is kind of a miracle, that like no one packed a lunch except for one little boy. And so the day passes, Jesus preaches. I mean, amazingly, I would love to hear that sermon. But finally, this crowd who's tired and hungry, as people do, they get a little grumpy. They start wanting food. And so the disciples are like freaking out because like, how are we going to feed thousands of people? And then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, he speaks up. He says, there's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? And again, this is probably one of Jesus' most famous miracles. It's in all 4 Gospels. And Jesus uses these 5 barley loaves and these 2 fish to feed thousands of people. And it's this incredible story of the generosity of this little boy, the learning curve for the disciples, the providence and provision of God. And it all starts because one little boy, we don't know his name, and probably his mom, who packed the lunch, probably, were generous with what they had. They stepped up and said, hey, I don't have a lot. All in all, I'm pretty powerless in this moment. But what I do have is yours. I mean, I could keep going. In fact, as I was researching for this sermon, there were so many more examples. It was hard to choose of seemingly insignificant, unheard of nobodies whose small, faithful steps made impacts in eternity. Men and women whose lives are mostly lost to the sands of time, except for one small act of faithfulness at just the right time that started a domino effect that changed the world. I think it's really easy to sit here in church and to hear stories about Joseph and Moses and David and Paul and other heroes of the Bible and get a little, intimidated. We get so caught up in these amazing acts of heroism that these characters did. And for some of us, we've heard some of these Bible stories so often that they've left the realm of possible and have become more like a comic book story than real life. It's like Moses might as well be Batman for how relatable he is to us, right? I'm just as likely to become Batman as I am to lead an entire group of people out of slavery and into a land provided to them by God, right? It's so easy to put these heroes of the Bible in these unreachable categories and to inflate their stories and their character traits to the point where they seem out of reach, like they're on some other planet. And we get into this mindset where we start to pick out the best character trait from every character in the Bible and elevate it to this impossible standard. It's like we have to simultaneously be as courageous as Esther and as wise as Solomon and as humble as Moses and as forgiving as Joseph and as faithful as Mary, and it just begins to pile up. And it's like, I can't live up to that. I can't simultaneously do all of these impossible things. And these ideals that we set for ourselves become these burdens of perfection that we carry around with us, completely blind to the fact that we're playing a comparison game with people who were just as flawed as you and me. But Christ never invites us to the comparison game. Christ never asks us to compare ourselves with one another. Instead, Christ calls us, in the way that he does, he calls us to something that's both so much easier and so much harder. He calls us, instead of trying to live up to the ideals of these characters and these heroes who were really also only playing a part, just as much as those servants and those unnamed heroes that we just talked about were in the right place at the right time, so were the heroes that we so often worship. But instead, Christ calls us to be humbly submitted to him, which again is the easiest and most challenging thing we could ever do. He calls us to be so in tune with him that taking the next right step becomes second nature to us. To be so in tune with him that we end up being in the right place at the right time, and we know and do the right thing because we're following his lead. He knows where the right place is. He'll lead us there. But he just asks that we humbly submit to his lordship, that we go where he leads, that we intentionally learn how to hear his voice. So we can say, oh, God, you want me over there? You want me to take that job? You want me to sit at that table? You want me to have that conversation? Okay, I'll do it. I have no idea what's next. I'm so underqualified for this job. I'm so terrified of that person you're asking me to talk to. But I'll do it because I'm humbly submitted to you. You see, honestly, most of the time, being humbly submitted to God means we end up living pretty humdrum, normal lives. Like, yes, God takes us on these amazing adventures, and he brings us places we never could have imagined, and he does incredible things in our lives, and he opens up our world. But in the grand scheme of things, most people who live humbly submitted to God don't end up in a history book. Most people who live humbly submitted to God, after a few generations, become anonymous. Even people who make incredible contributions to society are rarely talked about in our day-to-day lives. So the question becomes this: what are we living for? Are we living to be known, to be famous? I mean, like, maybe we recognize that, like, yeah, I'm probably, like, never going to be in the same room as, like, Taylor Swift or Jeff Bezos, or, you know, like, I'm probably not going to make it to the White House anytime soon. But, like, in my corner of the world, right? Like, when I go to Walmart, how many people do I see that I know? Or, you know, when I do something incredible, or at least something that I think is incredible, like, how many people are going to acknowledge me for it? How often am I going to get the recognition that I feel I deserve for my hard work? So do I crave recognition and power and achievement? Or am I living knowing that every day is not mine? And my days do not belong to me. They belong to the one who made me. I'm on borrowed time. So what are we living for? At the end of the day, ultimately, someone is going to say our name for the last time. So ultimately, it's not about whether or not people know our names, but rather it's about whether or not we lived faithfully. At the end of the day, the mark of a hero is not one grand, courageous act, but making the right choice day in and day out. Because the real heroes are the ones who understand it's not about trying to live up to the imperfect standards set by society, set by those who've gone before us and who have made the history books. The real heroic life is about lowering ourselves to the level of Jesus. As it says in Philippians 2, though he was God, Christ did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. That is the standard we're called to. That is what it means to do the right thing day in and day out. You see, the Bible is full of story after story of random, everyday, anonymous people who changed history. Not because of their own achievements or glory or power or position, but because they lived a life of humble submission to the God who writes eternity. People who changed history because they had the courage to speak when they could have remained silent. Sometimes they had the courage to remain silent when they wanted to speak. People who changed history because they disobeyed unrighteous laws, like those women who refused to murder babies, who were more concerned with enacting God's plans than they were with elevating themselves. Those are the kind of people who change history. Those are the kind of people who change their workplaces. Those are the kind of people who change their schools, their families, their hometown. People who are so much more concerned with enacting God's plan than with elevating themselves. So I want to leave you with one final thought this morning. There was once this man named Henry Nouwen. He was an incredible Catholic priest, a prominent Catholic priest who'd risen the ranks in, I don't even know what the ranks are, but he was up there. And he decided to embrace obscurity by living out the last decade of his life in a home for adults with physical and mental disabilities. He was paired with this man named Adam. And in his writings over and over again, he talks about how Adam taught him so much more than he could ever teach Adam. You see, in the last decade of his life, Henry Nouwen finally got it. It wasn't about rising through the ranks. It was about learning to slow down and learning to see the people that we live with every day. And so while reflecting on that time, he writes this. He says, "The fruits of your labors may be reaped 2 generations from now. Trust, even when you don't see the results." 2 generations from now. In other words, we may not get to see the fruits of our own labors. We may not get to see how our small, insignificant, faithful steps change history. And yet I promise you, if you live a life of being humbly submitted to God, even when we don't see the results, God uses that. God uses you to rewrite eternity. What an amazing gift. So the question I want to leave with you this morning is this: where in your life can you begin to embrace obscurity so that God's plan can be elevated? Jesus, thank you. Jesus, thank you for embracing obscurity. God, because even though we all know you, throughout history, thousands of people have known you. And yet, God, still, you embraced humility. You embraced embarrassment. You embraced torture. All for the sake of elevating God's plan above your own. So, Lord, let us leave today not with these plans of how we can make ourselves stand out, but God, let us leave today looking for ways to embrace obscurity, looking for ways to do the next right thing and not get any credit for it. God, let us leave today looking for ways to be humbly submitted to you and you alone. Lord, that's a high calling. It's one we can only do with your help. So God, I pray that you open up our hearts to be willing to accept the help that you so graciously give. Father, we love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so as we leave this morning, I want to leave you with this prayer of benediction. It's from 2 Corinthians 13:11. And it says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice. Strive for full restoration. Encourage one another. Be of one mind. Live in peace. And the God of love and peace will be with you." So with that, you are dismissed. Hang around, get to know one another, and as you go, be the church.